They went into the jungle to fight a war. The jungle fought back. But its deadliest weapon wasn't bullets. It was transformation. And the only way out was to become the monster. The helicopter descended like a metal dragonfly, its rotors churning the thick, humid air into a vortex of noise and displaced leaves. Below, the jungle awaited, an impenetrable emerald blanket stretching to the horizon, ancient and indifferent. Lieutenant Alvaro, gripping the worn strap of his seat, watched the verdant canopy rush up to meet them, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen plenty of jungles, served tours in territories where the earth itself seemed to breathe hostility. But this one felt different. He couldn't quite place it, but the air thrummed with an unspoken warning. When the skids finally kissed the soggy ground, the impact jarred his teeth. The roar of the rotors was a physical force, pressing against his eardrums, but then, almost immediately, it began to recede. It didn't fade gradually, as engine noise usually did, but was abruptly swallowed, as if the dense foliage had taken a sudden deep breath to hide its secrets. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy and suffocating, thick with an untold history. It was a silence that made his ears ache. 12 men disembarked, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, their rifles held close. They were a platoon, trained, hardened, but even their veteran eyes darted nervously, absorbing the overwhelming green. Their mission, received only hours before in a cold, emotionless voice over the base radio, was disturbingly vague. Locate an enemy group moving through these hills. No details on numbers, weapons, or routes. Only vague coordinates, a pinpoint on a map that now felt like the center of the world. Alvaro, commander of the mission, felt the weight of that silence press down on his chest, a leaden cloak draped over his shoulders. Every step his men took crushed damp leaves underfoot, each crunch echoing unnaturally loud in the void. Every breath carried the metallic taste of sweat and the earthy scent of decay. Yet there was something else, something beyond the humidity and the fatigue that already clung to them. A strange odor hung in the air, subtle at first, then growing more distinct with each advance. Iron, rot, and old blood, as if the ground itself concealed ancient, unhealed wounds beneath the impenetrable undergrowth. It was the smell of something very old and very wrong. Private Esteves, a wiry, perpetually suspicious man whose eyes seemed to miss nothing, muttered from the ranks, his voice barely a whisper against the oppressive quiet. "This jungle's dead, Lieutenant. Not even crickets are singing." Alvaro didn't reply, his gaze sweeping the shadowy trees, searching for any flicker of movement, any break in the oppressive green. Esteves was right. The usual symphony of the jungle, the chirping insects, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant calls of birds, was entirely absent. It was as if every living thing had fled, or worse, been silenced. He only tightened his grip on his rifle, the cold steel a small comfort, and pressed forward, signaling his men to maintain formation. The advance was slow, arduous. The canopy was so thick that only scattered shafts of light pierced the gloom, creating an eternal twilight. The air grew heavier, warmer, trapping the strange stench close. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the growing fatigue in their muscles and the increasing tension in their shoulders. They were deep within the jungle now, far from the familiar world, adrift in a sea of ancient trees and unknown dangers. Just as the last vestiges of daylight began to bleed away, painting the edges of the distant canopy in bruised purples and reds, they stumbled upon it. A clearing, small and eerily circular, where the vegetation seemed to have been violently pushed aside. In the soft, churned earth, amidst broken branches and disturbed moss, they saw the tracks. Enormous tracks, unlike anything they had ever encountered. They were irregular, alternating between what looked like crude, oversized human footprints and the distinct, deeply gouged impressions of massive claws. They didn't belong to any known animal, nor to any human. They were too large, too monstrously defined. Sergeant Nascimento, a burly, unflappable man who usually scoffed at anything that wasn't tangible, knelt, his brow furrowed in concentration. He traced the outline of one claw mark with a gloved finger, then looked up, his eyes meeting Alvaro's. A flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps profound confusion, crossed his face. The track was fresh, disturbingly so. It coiled away into the deepening shadows, a silent, terrifying invitation deeper into the jungle's embrace. Alvaro knew instinctively that whatever made those marks was still close, and it wasn't human. The silence, the smell, the missing crickets. It all coalesced into a single chilling realization. They were not just facing an enemy group, they were facing something far, far worse. He raised a hand, signaling a halt, his voice low and tight. "Set up a perimeter. We stop here for the night." The words felt hollow, a futile attempt at normalcy in a place where nothing was normal. As darkness fully enveloped them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by men, but by something ancient and patient, its breath a cold whisper against their necks. Whatever had left those tracks was not a ghost, but a very real, very hungry presence, drawing them ever deeper into its domain. The night was just beginning. The jungle swallowed the last sliver of twilight, plunging the platoon into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The air grew heavy, damp, and the strange metallic stench intensified, clinging to their uniforms, seeping into their skin. Alvaro watched his men move like ghosts in the gloom, setting up a hasty perimeter. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, amplified by the suffocating silence, sent shivers down their spines. It was a silence that promised violence, a void waiting to be filled with screams. They tried to establish radio contact, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the world they'd left behind. Private Ramirez, the comm specialist, hunched over his equipment, a faint glow from the display illuminating his tense face. He fiddled with the dials, adjusted the antenna, cursed under his breath. The static was relentless, a hiss and crackle that drowned out any hope of a signal. It was as if the air itself was actively hostile, swallowing the transmissions, refusing to let their pleas for help escape the ancient forest. Ramirez shook his head, his face pale. "Nothing, Lieutenant. Dead as a tomb. Can't even get a whisper." Alvaro's heart sank. They were truly alone. The unsettling tracks they'd discovered earlier seemed to snake deeper into the trees, leading into the heart of the unknown. Nascimento, ever the pragmatist, tried to analyze them, but his usual confidence was visibly shaken. He pointed to a tree trunk near the edge of the clearing where the tracks vanished. "Look here, Lieutenant." Etched into the bark, deep and splintered, were unmistakable claw marks mirroring the ones in the mud. They were too large for a bear, too precise for a random animal. And next to them, scuffed but undeniable, was another one of those distorted human-like footprints, as if whatever made the marks had braced itself, then leaped. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down Alvaro's spine. The creature wasn't just walking, it was capable of scaling trees, moving with a predatory grace that defied its size. As night fully claimed them, a fire was built, a small flickering circle of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and contort, playing tricks on their eyes, making every branch look like a reaching limb, every patch of darkness a lurking presence. The men huddled close, their faces illuminated, etched with a mixture of fatigue and growing fear. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices swallowed by the vastness of the jungle, their usual camaraderie replaced by a brittle unease. Then it came. A sound. Not human, not animal as they knew it. It started as a low, guttural rumble, vibrating through the very earth beneath their feet, rising slowly, inexorably, into a long, deep howl. It wasn't the sharp, territorial bark of a wolf, nor the mournful baying of a dog. This was something primeval, ancient, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the night itself. It echoed through the trees, bounced off the distant hills, multiplied by the uncanny silence, until it seemed to come from all directions at once, enveloping them in its terrifying symphony. Every man flinched, some gripping their rifles tighter, others simply staring wide-eyed into the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight. Sergeant Nascimento, always the one to try and lighten the mood, attempted a strained laugh. Just an echo. You know these jungles, plenty of myths, plenty of weird sounds, probably some kind of oversized monkey or something. His voice, however, lacked its usual conviction, and the forced chuckle died in his throat. Nobody joined in. Nobody even smiled. The howl faded, leaving behind an even deeper silence, one now charged with primal terror. The men remained frozen, their ears straining, waiting for it to return. The fire seemed to shrink, its warmth suddenly inadequate against the cold dread that permeated their ranks. Alvaro scanned their faces, seeing the unspoken questions, the growing fear. They were soldiers, trained for combat, but this was not combat as they knew it. This was something else entirely, something that preyed not just on their bodies, but on their very sanity. Sleep that night was a fractured, restless affair. Every man took his turn on watch, eyes bloodshot and wide, scanning the shadows for any hint of movement. They saw nothing, yet felt everything. The jungle breathed around them, a living, hostile entity. The strange smell seemed to grow stronger, almost cloying. And then, just before dawn, as the first faint hint of gray light began to pierce the eastern sky, it happened again. Another howl. This time, it wasn't distant. It was closer, much closer, and it wasn't alone. A second, then a third howl joined the first, a chilling chorus that seemed to ripple through the very ground beneath their feet. They weren't echoes. They were distinct, separate calls, emanating from different points around their perimeter, converging. It was a terrifying realization. The howls weren't getting closer. They were multiplying. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. Or perhaps it could multiply. The thought was infinitely more terrifying than any direct attack. Alvaro felt a cold sweat break out on his skin, despite the cool morning air. The jungle was alive, and it was watching them, an unseen presence that was slowly, methodically, tightening its grip. He knew then, with a dreadful certainty, that this was only the beginning. The morning light brought no solace, only a sickly gray pallor to the jungle. The air was heavy, charged with the lingering dread of the night's howls. Sleep had been a mirage, replaced by a twitchy, hyper-alert state that bordered on exhaustion. Every man moved with a strained urgency, their eyes bloodshot, their shoulders hunched. The silence that had initially unnerved them now felt like a predatory calm, a held breath before a fatal strike. The metallic tang of old blood in the air was stronger, a constant reminder of the unseen forces at play. Alvaro gave the order to move out, his voice hoarse, barely masking the gnawing anxiety in his gut. They maintained a tighter formation, their rifles held high, every man scanning the dense foliage with a desperate intensity. The vague coordinates of their mission now felt like a cruel joke, a meaningless destination in a world that had become entirely alien. Their objective had shifted. Survival. The hours that followed were a torturous blend of monotonous slogging and nerve-wracking anticipation. Each step was a battle against the thick undergrowth, the tangled roots, the unseen insects. The heat of the jungle burned, but the cold of fear was far more potent, a constant companion that seeped into their bones. Sweat plastered their uniforms to their skin, carrying the stench of their fear. Their eyes darted constantly, trying to guess from where the threat might emerge, straining against the perpetual gloom beneath the canopy. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent jolts of adrenaline through their systems. Then, it happened. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. They were traversing a particularly dense section, the path narrow, winding between enormous gnarled trees whose roots snaked across the ground like ancient serpents. Private Brito, a young, eager recruit who had always tried to keep a brave face, had been walking a few meters ahead of Esteves, just at the edge of the visible path. He had been there, a solid presence, his backpack swaying with his rhythmic steps. And then he wasn't. Esteves, ever vigilant, noticed the gap first. He stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing, scanning the spot where Brito had been. "Brito?" he called out, his voice sharp, laced with a sudden tremor. "Brito? You there?" Silence. The jungle, for a breath, seemed to hold its own. Alvaro, hearing the alarm in Esteves' voice, whirled around. "What is it, Esteves?" "Brito, Lieutenant. He was just here, right ahead of me. 1 minute he was there, the next, gone." Esteves' voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. No sound, no scream, just gone, like the forest just swallowed him whole. A wave of icy dread washed over Alvaro. He quickly ordered the platoon to halt, spreading out in a defensive perimeter. His mind raced, desperate to find a logical explanation. An ambush, a sniper? But there had been no shot, no telltale crack of a branch, no human cry of alarm. Just a horrifying, inexplicable absence. "Fan out," Alvaro commanded, his voice tight with urgency. "Search the immediate area, keep visual contact, stay sharp." They searched for hours, meticulously combing the dense undergrowth in widening circles. Every fallen log was turned over, every thicket peered into. The hope in their eyes slowly gave way to a dawning horror. The jungle remained silent, offering no clues, no answers, only its suffocating embrace. The strange, iron-like smell seemed to grow even more pungent, cloying and sickening. It was a macabre scent, a mixture of the jungle's decay and something deeply primal, deeply wrong. Just as despair began to settle in, Private Morales, a young green soldier whose face was now pale with terror, let out a choked cry. He was standing near a particularly dense cluster of ferns, his gaze fixed on something half buried in the damp leaves. Alvaro rushed over, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There, partially hidden, was Brito's backpack. It was torn, savagely ripped as if by immense force. The straps were shredded, the fabric gashed, and on its side, a dark, viscous stain bloomed, a deep, unsettling crimson. Blood. Too much blood for a mere fall, too dark to be anything but fresh. It glistened wetly in the filtered light, a stark, terrifying punctuation mark in the silent horror. Alvaro knelt, his fingers trembling as he touched the damp, clotted material. The smell of it was unmistakable now, the same metallic, sickly sweet scent that permeated the jungle. It was the smell of the unseen predator, the true enemy. Brito hadn't simply vanished. He had been taken. He gathered the remaining men, his gaze sweeping over their terrified faces. 9 left. Only 9. The exhaustion was etched deep into their features, but now, overriding it, was a raw, visceral fear. "All right, listen up." Alvaro's voice was low, firm, trying to project an authority he no longer fully felt. "We're not alone here, and whatever took Brito, it's not human. This isn't a conventional enemy. Stay tight, stay sharp. Every shadow, every sound could be it." His words hung in the air, a chilling confirmation of their worst fears. The jungle, with its suffocating silence and ancient secrets, was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant, a monstrous entity that had just claimed one of their own. They were the prey now, caught in a hunter's deadly game. The immediate threat wasn't a patrol of enemy soldiers. It was something far more ancient, far more terrifying, something that moved with unseen speed and left only torn backpacks and blood as its calling card. And it was still out there, watching, waiting, its unseen eyes burning in the gloom, drawing them further into the web of its monstrous design. The forest itself was a vast, silent maw, and they were slowly being devoured. The disappearance of Private Brito, so abrupt and inexplicable, tore at the fabric of the platoon's morale. The heavy, humid air of the jungle, once merely oppressive, now felt like a physical weight, pressing down on their chests, stealing their breath. The heat, a relentless, burning presence, was nothing compared to the cold grip of fear that had taken root deep within them. It was a fear that didn't just gnaw at their courage, but began to twist their perceptions, turning every familiar face into a potential stranger. They marched, if it could even be called that, in a state of suspended terror. Their movements were jerky, hesitant, their eyes darting constantly, not just into the foliage, but at each other. The usual easy banter had vanished, replaced by a strained, unnatural silence punctuated only by the heavy thump of their boots and the rasp of their breathing. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every sudden snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their systems. But now the fear had an added dimension. The enemy wasn't just external. The doubt began to eat away at their trust, slowly, insidiously, like a disease. The question that Esteves had whispered after Silva's disappearance, what if it wasn't only Silva, had planted a seed of suspicion that was now flourishing in the fertile ground of their terror. Who could they trust? Who among them might be different? The monstrous tracks, the inexplicable vanishing, the blood, it all fed into a growing paranoia that turned comrades into potential threats. That night they sought refuge under a massive rocky overhang, a dark, damp cavern that offered little comfort, but at least a semblance of shelter from the unseen eyes of the jungle. A small fire crackled weakly, its flames struggling against the pervasive dampness, casting flickering shadows that distorted their weary faces. The metallic stench, now almost overpoweringly sweet and sickly, seemed to cling to the rock walls. The exhaustion was palpable, a heavy cloak draped over every man. Sleep offered no escape. The howls from the previous night, though absent tonight, echoed in their minds, a haunting symphony of dread. Alvaro watched his men, their faces grim and drawn, their eyes hollow with fatigue and fear. He knew he had to keep them together, but he could feel the threads of their cohesion fraying. It was then that the silence of their despair was shattered. Private Mendez, a burly, usually good-natured man whose face was now a mask of raw nerves, pointed a trembling finger at Esteves. His voice, when it came, was tight with accusation, cutting through the heavy air like a knife. It was you. Every head snapped towards Mendez and Esteves. A sudden, tense quiet fell over the group, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Esteves, who had been meticulously cleaning his rifle, froze. He looked up, his perpetually suspicious eyes narrowing further. "What are you talking about, Mendez?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Brito," Mendez spat, his finger still leveled. "I saw it. When we got back from the search, there was blood on your uniform, Esteves. Dark, fresh. You were trying to wipe it off." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A collective gasp rippled through the men. Even Alvaro felt a jolt of alarm. He hadn't noticed. He had been too focused on the backpack, on the terror of Brito's disappearance. But Mendez's words painted a chilling picture. Esteves erupted, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He sprang to his feet, knocking his rifle to the ground with a clatter. "You lying bastard!" he roared, his voice echoing off the rock walls. He bared his arms, thrusting them forward, palms open. Look at me, there's nothing. It was sweat, you idiot, or mud. We were crawling through the goddamn jungle." He was practically vibrating with rage, his eyes wild. "You're trying to blame me for that thing? You want to believe your own men are the enemy, not the monster out there?" Mendez, though clearly intimidated by Esteves' fury, stood his ground, his face pale but resolute. "I know what I saw, Esteves, and I saw you cleaning it. You acted strange, you're always shifty." "Shifty?" Esteves lunged, his fists clenched, his anger momentarily eclipsing his fear. The other men scrambled back, drawing their weapons, unsure whether to break up the fight or prepare for something worse. Alvaro moved swiftly, stepping between them, pushing Esteves back with a firm hand on his chest. "That's enough, both of you. Stand down." His voice was a whip crack cutting through the rising tension. He fixed Esteves with a hard gaze, then Mendez. "We are a unit. We don't turn on each other. Not now. Not ever." Esteves, breathing heavily, glared at Mendez, but backed away, retrieving his rifle. Mendez stood trembling, his eyes still wary, distrust burning in their depths. Alvaro knew he had intervened just in time, but the damage was done. The seed of suspicion had taken root, deep and tenacious. Trust, once the bedrock of their survival, had fractured. They were now 9 men, isolated and terrified, their faith in each other eroded, each man now a potential suspect in the eyes of his comrades. As the uneasy quiet settled once more, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the agitated breathing of the men, a new sound began to filter in from the deeper jungle, subtle at first, then growing. It wasn't a howl, not yet. It was something else entirely. A grotesque, wet, tearing sound like raw flesh being stretched beyond its limits, accompanied by an unsettling, almost gurgling moan. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something that defied description, a sound of profound, unnatural suffering and transformation that made the hairs on the back of Alvaro's neck stand on end. His eyes met Estevez's across the dying fire, a shared horror passing between them. The external threat was returning, but now they were internally weakened, poisoned by doubt, making them infinitely more vulnerable to whatever unspeakable horror awaited them in the suffocating darkness. The grotesque sound from the jungle intensified, filling the oppressive silence under the rocky overhang. It was a wet, tearing, straining noise, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that was both animalistic and horribly, sickeningly human. It was the sound of a body being tortured, warped, stretched into something it was never meant to be. The men, their earlier confrontation forgotten, huddled closer to the meager fire, their faces pale, eyes wide with a shared primal terror. The pervasive stench of iron and rot in the air grew so thick it was almost suffocating, cloying and sweet like decaying flesh. Then, across the flickering light of the fire, a shadow writhed. It was Private Silva, one of the recruits, young and impressionable, who had been trying to get some rest near the edge of their small camp. His body began to convulse violently, a terrifying, uncontrolled spasm that shook him from head to toe. A low moan escaped his lips, quickly transforming into a choked gasp, then a horrifying, gurgling cry. His eyes rolled back into his head, showing only whites, glazed and unseeing, yet radiating a terrible internal agony. The men watched, frozen in horror, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Silva's uniform began to strain, the fabric stretching taut across his chest. His skin, already pale, seemed to ripple and flex beneath the cloth. Then, with a sickening, tearing sound that echoed the noises from the jungle, gashes began to split open on their own, spontaneously, as if something from within him was trying to break free. His chest swelled like a balloon about to burst, grotesquely distending, his ribs cracking audibly beneath the straining flesh. A collective gasp of terror escaped the platoon. This wasn't an injury. This was something far more horrifying. This was a transformation. Silva's screams, already raw and desperate, changed. They lost their human quality, becoming guttural, animalistic, a tortured blend of agony and something predatory. His bones shifted with sickening crunches, his limbs elongating, twisting. His fingers thickened, contorted, splitting into razor-sharp claws. His teeth grew, sharpening into wicked fangs that tore at his own lips. And then, before their horrified eyes, his human scream tore into an unearthly howl that ripped the night apart, a sound that mirrored the very howls that had haunted them since their arrival. "Open fire!" Alvaro roared, his voice choked with horror, but his training kicking in. He raised his rifle, not at an enemy soldier, but at what was once one of his men. The other soldiers, snapping out of their stunned paralysis, followed suit. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the dark, momentarily illuminating the unfolding nightmare. What remained of Silva, no longer a man but a monstrous beast, roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated savagery. Its body was now covered in coarse black fur, sleek and glistening. Its fangs were like knives, gleaming wickedly in the sporadic light. Its eyes, once human, now burned with an unnatural, predatory yellow, reflecting the muzzle flashes with terrifying intensity. The creature, impossibly fast, lunged. It didn't move like a man, nor like any animal they knew. It was a blur of black fur and razor claws, a nightmare made flesh. It moved too quickly for the soldiers to get a clear shot, darting between the trees, bullets sparking harmlessly against the thick bark. Mendez, still reeling from his confrontation with Esteves, was directly in its path. He barely had time to raise his rifle before the beast was on him, a black shadow blotting out the firelight. There was a sickening wet crunch, a brief choked gurgle from Mendez, and then a dry crack as his neck snapped with brutal force. The creature tossed him aside like a rag doll, his lifeless body crumpling to the ground, torn and broken. The firelight revealed the massacre in horrifying flashes. The creature, a grotesque parody of life, stalked through their camp, a whirlwind of destruction. Its howls filled the air, guttural and triumphant, mixing with the terrified shouts of the soldiers and the desperate rattle of automatic fire. Men scattered, trying to find cover, but the jungle offered little protection. The beast seemed to anticipate their movements, its yellow eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Alvaro fired clip after clip, aiming for its head, its chest, anywhere he could hit, but the bullets seemed to have little effect, merely sparking against its thick hide. He saw Private Santos fall, then Private Morales torn apart with horrifying efficiency. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and the sickening stench of the creature. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the monster paused. It let out one final piercing howl, a sound of victory and hunger, its yellow eyes sweeping over the few remaining terrified men. Then, with a speed that defied its monstrous bulk, it turned and melted back into the suffocating darkness of the jungle, leaving behind a trail of carnage, a lingering stench of blood and terror. Silence descended once more, but this was a silence that screamed. The fire crackled, illuminating the horrific scene. Mendez torn to pieces, his eyes wide and unseeing. Santos and Morales gone, dragged away by the creature, leaving only dark bloodstains on the earth. Around Alvaro, only 9 men remained alive, bloodied, sleepless, their faces stark with a horror that would forever haunt their dreams. Their numbers were dwindling, and the enemy was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and it was just one of them. The question that Esteves had whispered earlier now burned in Alvaro's mind. What if it wasn't only Silva? The thought was a cold, chilling whisper in the desolate aftermath, a harbinger of even greater horrors to come. The immediate aftermath was a blur of numb shock and visceral terror. 9 men remained, huddled around the smoldering embers of the fire, their faces smeared with mud, blood, and the ashes of their shattered courage. The jungle, now silent once more, seemed to breathe around them, a vast, malevolent entity silently assessing its handiwork. The metallic scent of blood was overpowering, an acrid reminder of Private Silva's monstrous transformation and Private Mendez's brutal demise. The very air felt thick with dread. The platoon, once a cohesive unit, had begun to unravel. The shock of witnessing one of their own transform, of fighting a creature that was once a comrade, had cracked their resolve beyond repair. Desperate pleas for retreat, for extraction, for anything to get them out of this living hell, rippled through the ranks. "We have to get out of here, Lieutenant." Private Ramirez, his face pale and tear-streaked, clutched his rifle like a lifeline. "We can't fight this. What is it?" "The radio's still dead, Ramirez," Alvaro responded, his voice hoarse, his own mind struggling to process the enormity of what they had just witnessed. He had tried again, briefly in the immediate chaos, but the static remained, a mocking hiss of their isolation. "We're cut off." The words hung heavy in the air, a death sentence. They were trapped, deep within the jungle, hunted by an unimaginable horror, with no way to call for help, no escape route. Despair began to settle in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The jungle itself seemed to toy with them, playing tricks on their traumatized minds. Phantom footsteps rustled in the undergrowth just beyond the perimeter, always just out of sight. Shadows, fleeting and formless, seemed to detach from the trees, only to vanish when looked at directly. It was a psychological torment, blurring the line between reality and hallucination, making them question their own senses. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind through the leaves became a potential threat, an unseen monster lurking in the periphery. Alvaro, once resolute and commanding, now moved with a haunted air. His eyes, though still sharp, held a hollow, distant look, as if he were already seeing horrors yet to come. Each order he spoke felt less like a command and more like a desperate incantation, uttered only to keep himself, and by extension his remaining men, standing. He was clinging to the last vestiges of his military discipline, trying to project a strength he no longer fully possessed. Then, Esteves, ever the provocateur, ever the voice of raw, unvarnished suspicion, whispered words that ignited a new, insidious terror, one that turned their fear inwards. He was crouched by the fire, sharpening his bayonet, his eyes darting between his comrades, cold and calculating. "He could still be among us," Esteves murmured, his voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames, yet cutting through the silence like a knife. What if it wasn't only Silva? The words were a spark in the tinderbox of their collective trauma. The men froze, their heads snapping towards Esteves. A profound, chilling silence descended. The question, once merely a lurking dread, was now given voice, echoing the very thought that had haunted Alvaro's own mind. If Silva could transform, if he could become that thing, then who was to say it wouldn't happen again? Who was to say it hadn't already happened? The creature had been fast, brutally efficient. Could it have bitten someone? Infected them? What were the symptoms? How would they know? The horrifying memory of Silva's grotesque transformation, the tearing skin, the bulging chest, the yellow eyes, flashed in every man's mind. The paranoia, which had begun to fester after Mendez's accusation, now exploded into full-blown dread. Every cough, every odd movement, every prolonged glance became suspect. Suddenly, the exhausted, traumatized faces around the fire weren't just comrades. They were potential hosts, ticking time bombs waiting to unleash another nightmare. Private Jenkins, a quiet, stoic man, suddenly seemed to flinch away from Private Rojas, who had been nervously scratching his arm. Rojas, noticing the movement, glared back, his hand dropping. "What's your problem, Jenkins?" "Nothing," Jenkins muttered, his eyes wide, then narrowed slightly, scanning Rojas's arm. "Just tired." "Tired?" Rojas scoffed, his voice laced with a tremor of fear and anger. "Or are you seeing something, Private? Are you seeing a new monster in me now?" The fragile truce that had held them together, despite their earlier arguments, shattered. The weight of the monster, the jungle and their own dwindling numbers pressed down, forcing them to turn on each other. Alvaro watched, helpless, as the suspicion spread like wildfire, consuming their last vestiges of trust. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the true enemy wasn't just the beast that prowled the jungle. It was the fear itself, tearing them apart from within. And as the night deepened, he couldn't shake the chilling realization that Esteves's whispered words had unleashed a more insidious horror than any physical monster. The jungle was transforming them, not just their bodies, but their very souls, turning them into a panicked, distrustful mob, ripe for the taking. The silent lurking threat now had an ally, their own escalating paranoia. The night dragged on, a suffocating eternity under the oppressive canopy. Esteves's chilling question, what if it wasn't only Silva, had taken root, blossoming into a terrifying, pervasive paranoia that gnawed at the remaining 8 men. Sleep was an impossible luxury, haunted by the specter of transformation and betrayal. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every distant rustle of leaves was magnified into an approaching threat. The air, thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and that lingering metallic rot, felt like it was actively trying to choke them. The distrust, once a creeping unease, now manifested openly. Soldiers, comrades who had once trusted each other implicitly, now eyed one another with suspicion, searching for any sign, any telltale twitch, any abnormal movement. Alvaro's authority, already hanging by a thread, was stretched to its breaking point. He watched, a helpless spectator to the slow, agonizing disintegration of his unit. It wasn't long before the tension snapped. Private Diaz, a usually level-headed machine gunner, had been silently observing Private Ramos, whose skin had developed an angry red rash from an insect bite. Ramos, exhausted and irritable, scratched at it relentlessly. Diaz, his eyes wide with a manic intensity, finally couldn't take it anymore. "What's that on your arm, Ramos?" Diaz demanded, his voice thin, laced with accusation. "Is that a wound? Are you hiding something?" Ramos, startled and defensive, snapped back. "It's a goddamn bug bite, you idiot. What, you think I'm turning into some kind of monster now?" "How do we know?" Diaz challenged, stepping closer, his rifle held loosely but ominously in his hands. Silva started with just a little twitch, then a scream. Next thing, he was ripping Mendez apart. "How do we know you're not next? How do we know you're not already changing?" "You paranoid bastard!" Ramos roared, his own fear escalating into fury. He shoved Diaz hard. "I'm fine. We're all going crazy because of you." The words devolved into a raw, desperate brawl. Fists flew, shouts echoed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Two soldiers, once united by a common uniform and purpose, were now tearing at each other like cornered animals, their anger fueled by terror and suspicion. They grappled in the mud, their struggles desperate and pathetic. Alvaro, his own mind reeling from exhaustion and the incessant dread, lunged into the fray, his last reserves of strength channeled into breaking them apart. "Stop it, both of you. This is what it wants, to break us. We are not the enemy." He pulled Diaz away, then Ramos, his voice a strained roar, trying to assert some semblance of control over the chaos. But even as he separated them, he could see the lingering fear in their eyes, the distrust that would now forever mark their interactions. His authority had never felt so fragile. His men were teetering on the edge of a precipice, their minds fracturing under the relentless pressure. The jungle, meanwhile, continued its psychological warfare. Whispers seemed to drift on the humid air, indistinct, yet undeniably there, just beyond the range of comprehension. Sometimes it sounded like their names, called out in a familiar voice. Other times it was a low, sibilant hiss, an ancient, mocking laugh. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, fleeting glimpses of movement that vanished when directly confronted. Were they real? Or were their sleep-deprived, terrified minds conjuring phantoms? The line between sanity and madness blurred with every passing moment. Private Esteves, watching the unraveling, maintained a terrifying calm, his eyes unsettlingly bright. He seemed to thrive on the chaos, his paranoia morphing into a grim, self-fulfilling prophecy. He continued to eye everyone, a silent, predatory assessment in his gaze, as if already searching for the next symptom. The men were exhausted, their bodies aching, their minds frayed. Hallucinations became more common. Private Jenkins swore he saw Brito standing silently amongst the trees, his torn backpack still on his shoulders, before he blinked and the image was gone. Private Rojas kept seeing Silva's glowing yellow eyes in the dark, even when no such light existed. They were trapped not just in a physical cage of dense foliage, but in a psychological one, their own minds turning against them. Alvaro himself felt the insidious creep of irrationality. He kept catching the faint, sickly sweet scent of blood, even when he knew there was no new injury, no fresh spill. He heard the distant howls, even though the jungle was currently silent. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to clear the visions, but they lingered, teasing, tormenting. They were now 8 men, a group of shattered individuals, isolated not just by the jungle, but by their own crippling fear and suspicion. Their internal demons were as potent as the external monster. The constant feeling that something is wrong had escalated into a terrifying certainty. Everything was wrong, irreparably so. They were merely waiting, like lambs to the slaughter, for the next manifestation of horror. As the first faint glimmers of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in bruised purples, a new sound, distinct from the phantom whispers and the echoes of their own fear, began to emerge from the depths of the jungle. It was a low, resonant growl, vibrating through the very ground, a sound of immense power and malevolence. It was the sound of a predator, no longer toying with its prey, but drawing near, ready to strike. The psychological torment was over. The physical horror was about to begin again. The trap was sprung, and they, the deluded prey, were utterly vulnerable, their internal divisions making them easy pickings for the approaching darkness. The low, resonant growl from the jungle solidified into a tangible presence, vibrating through the very earth beneath their feet. It was a sound that shook them to their cores, cutting through the haze of exhaustion and paranoia that had gripped them. The dawning light, rather than offering relief, merely revealed the stark, terrified faces of the remaining 8 men, their eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the impenetrable tree line. The air, heavy with the metallic stench of blood and the oppressive humidity, now crackled with an undeniable, terrifying energy. On the 3rd night of their descent into hell, the thing returned. It didn't attack immediately, however. Its approach was a deliberate, agonizing torment, a masterful display of psychological warfare. The growl was followed by another, then another, until the jungle was filled with a chorus of guttural, primeval roars. The howls, the same bone-chilling cries that had haunted their first night, began to multiply, echoing and reverberating through the trees, surrounding their meager camp from all directions. "It's everywhere," Private Jenkins whispered, his voice trembling, his finger pointing wildly into the gloom. "There are dozens of them. It's an ambush." The men, their minds already frayed, instantly fell victim to the illusion. The multiplying howls, the sense of being encircled, convinced them that they were facing an entire pack of the monstrous creatures. Panic threatened to overwhelm them. Their formation, already loose, tightened reflexively. They formed a desperate, trembling ring, their backs to each other, rifles raised, barrels sweeping the tree line. Their hearts pounded in a frantic, terrifying unison, a drumbeat of impending doom. Alvaro, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, felt a cold, logical sliver of doubt. It sounded like many, yes, but the sheer speed and agility of the creature they had faced with Silva's transformation. How could so many move so silently, and then suddenly erupt in such a cacophony? Still, he knew the illusion was potent, crippling. His priority was to keep his men focused, ready. "Hold your fire," Alvaro commanded, his voice strained but firm, cutting through the rising tide of panic. "Don't shoot until you have a target. We don't waste ammo." The howls continued, ceaseless and terrifying, closer now, emanating from the very edge of their camp. They could hear the heavy thud of unseen movement in the undergrowth, the rustle of leaves as massive forms stalked their perimeter. The air grew colder, despite the jungle's heat, as if the very presence of the creature sucked the warmth from their surroundings. The smell of rot and old blood became almost unbearable, a physical assault on their senses. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the mental clock a hammer blow against their sanity. The men strained their eyes against the suffocating darkness, their fingers hovering on their triggers, muscles aching from the tension. They were waiting for the charge, for the sudden, violent assault, but it didn't come. Instead, the howls intensified, a relentless, terrifying psychological siege. It was as if the creature was playing with them, enjoying their terror, savoring the moment before the kill. Then slowly, inexorably, the moon began to break through the heavy clouds that had obscured it. A faint silvery light filtered through the dense canopy, casting long, shifting shadows that danced and writhed on the jungle floor. The howls reached a crescendo, a final deafening chorus of menace. And then, as the moonlight illuminated the edge of the clearing, the horror revealed itself. It was just one massive, grotesque form, standing silhouetted against the filtered moonlight, its outline undeniably clear. Not dozens, not a pack, just one. The same creature that had been Silva. The same beast that had ripped Mendez apart. Yet its body had changed. It was bigger, vastly bigger, its muscles rippling under the slick black fur. Its limbs were thicker, more powerful, ending in claws that glinted wickedly in the moonlight. Its head was more twisted, more monstrous, the fangs longer, sharper, dripping with unseen fluids. Its yellow eyes, now burning with an even more malevolent intensity, glowed like twin hellfire in the gloom, fixed on them with an unnerving, predatory intelligence. It wasn't just bigger, it was more twisted, more powerful, as though every transformation, every life it took, every ounce of flesh it consumed fed its grotesque growth, making it stronger, more monstrous. The sight was sickening, terrifying, a physical manifestation of their worst nightmares. The earlier howls had been an illusion, a cruel trick. It was a single, immensely powerful entity, and it had grown. A collective, shuddering gasp went through the remaining men, their fear momentarily replaced by a profound, sickening awe at the sheer size and monstrosity of the creature. The illusion of a pack had shattered, replaced by the infinitely more terrifying reality of a singular, evolving, immensely powerful predator. The circle had tightened, not just around them, but around the truth of their situation. There was only one enemy, but it was more than enough. And now, under the cruel, revealing light of the hunter's moon, it was ready to finally begin its feast. The waiting was over. The revelation of the creature's singular, monstrous form, starkly illuminated by the filtering moonlight, sucked the air from the lungs of the remaining 8 soldiers. The illusion of a pack, which had given them a desperate hope of at least fighting multiple smaller entities, shattered. In its place stood a singular, impossibly huge, grotesquely twisted beast, its yellow eyes burning with an ancient, malevolent intelligence that spoke of untold horrors. It was bigger, more powerful, a living testament to the gruesome feast it had already consumed. The fear that had gripped them since their arrival intensified, crystallizing into a raw, primal terror. The monster let out a guttural roar, a sound of absolute triumph and predatory hunger that vibrated through the earth and rattled their very bones. Then it lunged. The attack was a blur of speed and brutal efficiency. It didn't stalk, it charged, a black hulking mass of muscle and fangs. Its movements were too fluid for its size, too fast for human eyes to track. It moved like a nightmare made real, a whirlwind of death that tore through their hastily formed defensive ring. "Open fire! Fire!" Alvaro screamed, his voice raw, his rifle already spitting bullets. The other men, galvanized by the immediate threat, unleashed a desperate volley. Muzzle flashes lit the dark jungle in blinding stroboscopic bursts, momentarily revealing the creature as it weaved and ducked, seemingly invulnerable. Bullets sparked off its thick, fur-covered hide, or tore harmlessly into the surrounding trees. Private Rojas, caught at the edge of the circle, was the first to fall. The creature was on him in an instant, a black shadow blotting out the moon. There was a brief, choked cry, a sickening tear of flesh, and then Rojas was gone, dragged into the deeper shadows beyond the reach of the firelight. The speed was terrifying, the silence of his disappearance almost more horrifying than a scream. Panic flared. The men, their formation broken, began to scatter, their discipline crumbling under the sheer, overwhelming terror. They fired wildly, blindly, their rounds tearing through the foliage, hoping to hit something, anything. But the monster was too fast, too cunning. Private Jenkins, seeing the creature emerge from the shadows with a bloodied muzzle, hesitated for a fatal second. He raised his rifle, but his hands were trembling, his face contorted in a silent scream. The monster slammed into him with the force of a freight train, sending him flying backwards, his body crumpling against a tree trunk with a sickening thud. Before he could even register the pain, the creature was on him, its fangs tearing into his throat with a brutal, tearing sound. His screams were abruptly cut off, replaced by a grotesque gurgle, then silence. One by one they fell. The jungle became a chaotic symphony of desperate gunfire, terrified shouts, and the creature's triumphant roars. Private Ramirez, the comms specialist, went down next, a swift, brutal strike that crushed his head. Esteves, surprisingly, put up a fight, emptying a full clip into the monster's chest at point-blank range, only for the bullets to have no discernible effect. The creature swatted him aside, its massive claw tearing a deep gash across his chest before he even hit the ground. Esteves, usually so sharp, so suspicious, now lay gasping, staring up at the moon with unseeing eyes, his lifeblood quickly pooling on the damp earth. Alvaro fought with a desperate primal ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He saw his men, his comrades, torn to pieces before his eyes, their lives extinguished in flashes of brutal, monstrous violence. The smell of blood was now overwhelming, a thick coppery mist that coated his tongue and burned his nostrils. He tried to think, to strategize, but the sheer speed and invulnerability of the creature defied all logic, all training. It was an unstoppable force of nature, a living embodiment of ancient horror. He emptied another magazine, the spray of bullets sparking against the monster's hide, eliciting nothing more than a frustrated snarl. Its yellow eyes, gleaming with intelligent malice, fixed on him. Alvaro was one of the last standing. The monster seemed to pause, almost studying him, as if savoring the final moments of its prey. It was no longer just about killing. It was about psychological torment, about witnessing the complete annihilation of hope. The monstrous form coiled, preparing for its final lunge. Alvaro's rifle clicked empty, the metallic sound an abrupt, deafening punctuation mark in the chaos. He was out of ammunition. Only he and Sergeant Nascimento remained, their backs to each other facing the nightmare. Nascimento, his face a mask of grim determination, was firing his last few rounds, but it was clear it was futile. The creature was coming for Alvaro. Its yellow eyes burned, its massive head lowered, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. Alvaro felt the cold grip of death, but something snapped within him. Not despair, but a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He would not die cowering. He would not die broken. He would make this beast pay. He saw Nascimento fall, a final despairing cry before he was silenced. And then Alvaro was truly alone. The moonlight, now fully piercing the canopy, illuminated him, the solitary figure, rifle empty, facing down the monstrous entity. This was the end, but he would not go quietly. The jungle, once a cacophony of gunfire and screams, fell into a sudden eerie silence, broken only by Alvaro's ragged breathing and the low, triumphant growl of the monster. He was the last man standing, his rifle clicking empty, the cold steel suddenly useless in his trembling hands. Around him, the bodies of his men lay scattered, a testament to the brutal, overwhelming power of the creature that now stood before him. Its yellow eyes, burning with a predatory fire, fixed on him, a silent promise of his impending doom. The pervasive stench of blood and scorched earth was a suffocating shroud, but Lieutenant Alvaro, pushed to his absolute limit, refused to yield. His training, his instinct for survival, and a raw, visceral rage ignited within him. He was a soldier, and he would fight to the last breath. He would not die like a lamb. With a defiant roar that was more animalistic than human, he unclipped his bayonet from his now useless rifle. The cold steel gleamed dully in the moonlight, a pathetic weapon against the creature's immense size and terrifying power. But it was all he had. He held it firm, his knuckles white, his stance resolute. The monster, perhaps amused by his defiance or perhaps simply enjoying the prolonged agony of its final prey, stalked closer. Its massive, twisted head lowered, its fangs dripping, a low, guttural rumble emanating from its chest. It was a picture of pure, unadulterated malevolence, a nightmare made flesh. Alvaro didn't wait. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, not at the creature's massive body, but at its exposed flank, hoping for a weak spot, a chink in its impenetrable armor. He drove the bayonet forward with all his might, aiming for the area just behind its shoulder, where the fur seemed slightly thinner. The steel struck with a sickening crunch, not the satisfying thud of flesh and bone, but the scraping clang of metal against something incredibly hard, almost rock-like. The blade bent almost double against the creature's mutated ribs, failing to penetrate. It was like stabbing a moving wall of granite. The monster roared, not in pain, but in irritation. It backhanded Alvaro with a massive clawed paw. The blow sent him flying, spinning through the air before he slammed against a thick tree trunk, the impact stealing his breath and sending a searing pain through his ribs. He fell to the ground, his head ringing, vision blurring. The bayonet, twisted and useless, lay just out of reach. He looked up, gasping for air, his vision clearing just enough to see the monster towering over him. Its yellow eyes glowed with triumph, its fangs bared in a silent, terrifying snarl. It raised a massive clawed foot, preparing to stomp him into the earth, to crush the last vestige of resistance. Despair, cold and absolute, began to creep in. This was it. There was no escape. But then, as his hand instinctively went to his belt, his fingers brushed against something else. Something heavy, metallic, and cold. A grenade. His last one. A desperate, reckless plan, born of pure adrenaline, and the certainty of impending death flashed through his mind. If he couldn't kill it, perhaps he could at least wound it. Perhaps he could buy himself a final glorious act of defiance. With a surge of strength he didn't know he had, Alvaro ripped the grenade from his belt. The monster's foot was already descending, a monstrous shadow blotting out the moon. Time seemed to slow. He pulled the pin with his teeth, the small click impossibly loud in the overwhelming silence. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second. Then, with a final, desperate roar, he hurled the grenade, not at the monster's head, but at its feet, aiming for the soft, damp earth directly beneath its massive bulk. The small, metallic sphere bounced once, twice, a pathetic toy in the face of such monstrous power. The creature paused, its yellow eyes widening slightly, as if confused by the object at its feet. It didn't understand. It was too late. The explosion lit the jungle in a blinding flash, a searing white-hot light that momentarily eclipsed the moon and the stars. A deafening roar followed, a colossal concussion that ripped through the air, vibrating through Alvaro's very bones, even as he instinctively curled into a fetal position, shielding his head. Earth, trees, and silence were hurled into the air, a chaotic maelstrom of destruction. The ground heaved, then settled, leaving behind a ringing void. The blast swallowed everything, the monster, the jungle, and for a terrifying moment even Alvaro's consciousness. And then there was nothing, only an abrupt, absolute silence, more profound than any before, stretching out into the dark, desolate night. Alvaro awoke hours later, though he couldn't tell how many. The world was a muffled, ringing void. The explosion had stolen his hearing, leaving him in a silent, distorted reality where only vibrations registered. His head throbbed with a searing pain, a dull, insistent ache that permeated his entire being. He lay sprawled in the churned earth, covered in a thick layer of dirt, ash, and his own dried blood. The coppery scent an acrid reminder of the night's carnage. His body screamed in protest as he slowly, painstakingly pushed himself up. Every muscle ached, every bone felt bruised. He coughed, spitting out grit and dust, his throat raw. The moon, now high above, cast a sickly silver glow through the tattered canopy, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. The ground where the monster had stood, where he had hurled the grenade, was charred black. A gaping crater, smoking faintly, marked the epicenter of the blast. Trees around it were splintered, some reduced to smoking stumps, their branches stripped bare, their leaves scattered like confetti. The smell of burned flesh mingled with the familiar metallic tang of blood and the damp earth, creating a sickening, pervasive odor that seemed to cling to everything. Alvaro staggered forward, his movements stiff and uncoordinated, his mind struggling to process the reality of his surroundings. He scanned the scene, his eyes wide, bloodshot. The monster's body was gone. There was no trace of it. No mangled corpse, no charred remains. Only the desolate burned earth, a gaping wound in the jungle floor. Had the explosion vaporized it? Or had it simply fled, a phantom in the smoke, its unnatural resilience defying even a direct hit? The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through him. He moved among the wreckage, his heart sinking with each step. The bodies of his men were scattered, grim markers of the battle. Sergeant Nascimento, Private Esteves, Private Jenkins, Private Diaz, Private Ramos, Private Ramirez, all of them. Lifeless, torn, broken, or simply missing, evaporated by the blast or dragged away in its immediate aftermath. None of them had survived. Not a single one. He was alone, the sole survivor of a platoon that had vanished into the jaws of a nightmare. A wave of profound grief, mixed with a chilling sense of isolation, washed over him. He knelt beside what he recognized as Sergeant Nascimento's mangled rifle, its stock shattered, the barrel bent. He picked up a dog tag, crusted with dirt, its chain broken. It was Esteves's. His fingers trembled as he closed his hand around it, the cold metal a stark reminder of the lives lost, the horrors witnessed. The silence, amplified by his temporary deafness, was unbearable. It was a silence that screamed of death, of loss, of an unspeakable terror that had devoured his men and left him stranded. The jungle, now scarred by the explosion, seemed to watch him, its ancient eyes seeing through his battered form, into the depths of his traumatized soul. It felt alive, a malevolent presence even in its stillness. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't. The desolation, the lingering stench, the ghostly presence of his fallen comrades. It was too much. He had to move. He had to escape this living tomb. Driven by a primal instinct, a desperate need to put distance between himself and the horror, he turned and began to walk. He walked alone through the jungle for what felt like an eternity, unable to count the days, each step an agonizing effort. His sense of direction was a fractured memory, his mind a fractured mess. He moved through a world without sound, a silent nightmare, relying only on his eyes and the desperate hope that somewhere, anywhere, there was an end to this green hell. He subsisted on what little he could find, berries, insects, driven by a raw, guttural need to survive. Every rustle of leaves, every imagined shadow, every waft of that metallic, sickly sweet smell sent jolts of fear through him. He was a ghost, wandering through a graveyard, haunted by the specter of the monster and the faces of his lost men. His body was a map of scrapes, cuts, and bruises, but his mind was far more wounded. He was fractured, teetering on the edge of delirium, yet something deep within him, a stubborn spark, refused to extinguish. He had to escape. He had to make it back. Even if it was just to tell the tale, to warn others of the unspeakable horror that lurked in this ancient, silent jungle. He pushed on, one weary, painful step after another, his only companion the profound, unsettling silence that now defined his world. The jungle stretched out before him, endless and indifferent, a green maw that had swallowed his platoon, and was now trying its best to consume him too. Days blurred into an agonizing, solitary struggle for survival. Alvaro, deafened, battered, and on the precipice of delirium, stumbled through the relentless embrace of the jungle. His uniform, once crisp, was now torn rags, caked with mud, blood, and the omnipresent grime of the forest. Thirst gnawed at his throat, hunger a constant sickening ache in his stomach. His mind, fractured by what he had witnessed, played cruel tricks on him. He saw them, his men, fleeting shadows amongst the dense trees. Brito just ahead, turning to wave, before dissolving into the foliage. Mendez, his face contorted in pain, pleading silently from behind a thicket of ferns. Silva, his yellow eyes burning, half hidden in the gloom, watching him with an unsettling intensity. He heard whispers on the wind, the voices of his fallen comrades, indistinct and distorted, a tormenting chorus of his guilt and grief, though he knew logically his ears were dead. Each hallucination, each phantom chipped away at his fragile hold on reality. He pushed on, driven by a primal, desperate instinct that transcended exhaustion and despair. His body moved on autopilot, a hollow vessel fueled by the desperate need to escape the living tomb. The metallic, sickly sweet stench of blood, that scent that had haunted them from the very beginning, now seemed to emanate from him, from his clothes, From his very pores, a constant, sickening reminder of the horror he had survived. He lost track of time. Was it 3 days? 5? A week? The sun rose and set, a dim, distant glow through the canopy, marking the endless cycle of his torment. He found water in puddles, scrounged for edible roots and insects, his survival a testament to the sheer, unyielding will to live. He spoke to himself, whispered commands, his voice hoarse and raw, needing to hear a human sound, even if only his own, in the overwhelming silence of his world. Then, against all odds, when his spirit was at its lowest ebb, when his legs felt like lead and his eyes could barely focus, he stumbled onto it, a road. Not a paved highway, but a dirt track, overgrown with weeds clearly not used frequently, yet undeniably a sign of civilization. It was a lifeline, a sudden, blinding beacon of hope in the suffocating green. He stared at it, tears blurring his vision, unable to believe his eyes. He collapsed onto the dusty earth, his body shaking with a mixture of relief and utter exhaustion. He had made it. He had actually made it. He lay there for what felt like hours, simply breathing, feeling the rough texture of the road beneath his ravaged hands. His hearing began to return, slowly, painfully, a dull roar at first, then gradually resolving into the subtle sounds of the jungle, the distant chirping of unseen insects, the rustle of leaves, the gentle hum of life. It was a symphony he had once longed for, now a source of jarring noise after days of silence. Finally, a faint rumble. Distant at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable sound of an engine. He struggled to his feet, swaying precariously, waving his arms, a desperate, tattered figure against the vast backdrop of the jungle. A military patrol vehicle, dusty and worn, rounded the bend. The soldiers inside, their faces initially grim and watchful, stared at him in disbelief. He was a ghost, a survivor from a mission long thought lost, covered in dirt and blood, his uniform in tatters, his eyes wild with unspeakable horrors. They pulled him in, their questions a muffled blur, their concern genuine. Alvaro mumbled incoherent words, a torrent of fragmented images and raw terror. He was safe. He was rescued. Back at base, the debriefing was a blur. Medics attended to his physical wounds, while military intelligence officers pressed him for answers. He gave them a report, a heavily redacted version of the truth, carefully constructed to maintain some semblance of sanity. He claimed they had been ambushed by hostile forces, a surprise attack that had wiped out his entire platoon. He spoke of enemy fire, overwhelming numbers, fierce resistance. He offered no further detail, no mention of transforming monsters, of yellow eyes, of impossible speed, of a curse. He couldn't. Who would believe him? They would think him mad, broken by the jungle. He presented a narrative they could comprehend, a military tragedy, a sacrifice of brave men. The officers, while noting his evasiveness and the obvious trauma, accepted his account. The jungle was known for its brutal, unforgiving nature, for its unseen enemies. Another platoon lost to its depths, a grim statistic of war. But in the quiet, sterile confines of the military hospital, in the long, dark nights that followed, Alvaro knew the truth. The world outside the jungle might have accepted his lie, might have closed the book on the tragedy, but the jungle had left its indelible mark, not just on his body, but on his soul. He was out, but he was not free. He carried the jungle within him, a silent, festering wound that no clean hospital bed, no reassuring words could ever heal. He had escaped hell, but hell, he realized with a chilling certainty, had escaped with him. Life back in civilization felt alien, a stark, unsettling contrast to the primal chaos of the jungle. The clean lines of the base, the polite hum of machinery, the distant chatter of human voices, all of it seemed superficial, brittle, easily shattered. Alvaro, physically recovering, was a shadow of his former self. His once sharp gaze was now haunted, constantly scanning his surroundings, searching for threats that weren't there, or perhaps were. He tried to resume a normal life, but the world felt wrong, hollow. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom smells of blood and rot clinging to him long after the dreams faded. The metallic taste in his mouth, the one that had permeated the jungle, was now a constant companion, a bitter reminder of the horrors he had endured. His temporary deafness had faded, his hearing returning to normal. But now, a new torment began. He heard it. The same distinct howl. At first it was distant, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper on the edge of his auditory perception. He'd dismiss it as a trick of the wind, a memory, a phantom sound from his fractured mind. But it would return, night after night, slowly, insidiously, growing closer, deeper, more menacing with each passing time. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, a primal, chilling call that spoke of ancient evil and relentless pursuit. He tried to rationalize it. PTSD, auditory hallucinations, the lingering echoes of trauma. He saw the base psychologist, a kind, empathetic woman who listened patiently to his heavily censored accounts of the ambush, never pressing him for details he wasn't ready to give. She spoke of coping mechanisms, of recovery, of time, but time brought no solace, only the chilling certainty that the howl was real, and it was getting closer. He knew the truth, a cold, undeniable certainty that had burrowed deep into his consciousness. The explosion hadn't killed the monster, it hadn't even truly stopped it. Perhaps it had only scattered it, broken it, or more terrifyingly, set it free in a new, more insidious way. A horrifying realization began to creep into his mind, an insidious whisper that grew louder with each passing day, each closer howl. What if the curse hadn't been contained to the jungle? What if it had spread? What if he himself carried it now, incubating in the silence of his exhausted body? The pervasive stench of blood, which he had initially attributed to the jungle, to the massacre, to the lingering trauma, now seemed to emanate from him. He showered incessantly, scrubbing his skin raw, trying to rid himself of the smell, but it was always there, subtle yet undeniable, a phantom odor that only he seemed to detect. It was a scent of fresh blood mixed with something else, something primal and feral, that made his stomach churn. He started noticing subtle changes. His senses, once dulled by trauma, sharpened to an unnerving degree. He could hear the faint scuttling of insects in the walls, the distant creak of floorboards in the barracks, sounds that would normally go unnoticed. His vision seemed to grow more acute in low light, the shadows around him taking on a crisp, almost tangible quality. He would wake up feeling inexplicably restless, a burning, primal energy thrumming beneath his skin, an urge to move, to run, to hunt. He looked at his hands, his reflection in the mirror. He saw the dark circles under his eyes, the gauntness of his face, the persistent tremor in his fingers. But sometimes, when he looked very closely, he thought he saw something else. A subtle tightening of his features, a sharpening of his jawline, a faint, almost imperceptible glint in his eyes that wasn't quite human. One night, the howl came from just outside his barracks window. It was so close, so distinct, that he sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. It wasn't an echo anymore. It was a direct address, a call. He knew then, with a dreadful, sickening certainty, he hadn't just survived the jungle. He had brought a piece of it back with him. The monster hadn't died in the explosion. Perhaps it had merely found a new host. Perhaps in his desperate fight for survival, in his desperate act of throwing the grenade, he had not ended the curse, but unleashed it, and was now its unwitting carrier. The howls weren't just haunting him. They were calling to him, and he felt an unsettling, dangerous pull, a nascent urge to answer that call, to join in that ancient, primal song. The jungle was still with him, whispering promises, stirring the beast that now resided, dormant but growing, deep within his own flesh and blood. The true horror, he realized, was only just beginning. The insidious changes within Alvaro accelerated. The subtle alterations he had glimpsed in his reflection now became undeniable, more pronounced with each passing day. He grew withdrawn, his conversations curt, his eyes distant. His once robust physique seemed to refine itself, his muscles growing taut, his movements becoming unnaturally fluid, almost predatory. His senses, already heightened, became hyperacute. Every smell, every sound, every flicker of movement a vibrant, overwhelming assault. He craved solitude, the quiet embrace of shadows, away from the jarring noise and artificial light of civilization. The military, attributing his odd behavior to extreme PTSD, tried to offer more support, more therapy. But Alvaro pushed them away. He knew what was happening to him, and he knew no amount of therapy could cure this. This was not a wound of the mind. It was a transformation of the very essence of his being. The pervasive stench of blood, mixed with that ancient, earthy rot, was no longer just in his mind. It clung to him, a faint yet undeniable aura that seemed to mark him, drawing strange, uneasy glances from those around him. And the howls, they were no longer just a haunting memory or a distant call. They were a constant, resonant thrum beneath his skin, a yearning, a primal song that resonated deep within his bones. He felt an uncontrollable urge, a powerful draw back to the wild, to the deep, silent jungle that had claimed his men, and now claimed him. The last time Lieutenant Alvaro was seen on base, before his sudden and unexplained desertion, someone swore that his eyes were no longer the same. They weren't just tired or haunted, they glowed. A faint, unsettling yellow, sharp as blades beneath the pale light of the moon, reflecting an ancient, predatory intelligence that had completely consumed the man he once was. His face, once etched with the grim lines of human suffering, now held a terrifying, almost serene, feral beauty. He slipped away in the dead of night, leaving behind his uniform, his rank, his identity. He shed the last vestiges of his humanity as effortlessly as a snake shedding its skin. He didn't run. He flowed, a dark shadow melting into the night, drawn by an irresistible primal urge, an ancient whisper from the depths of the forest. The jungle called to him, and he finally answered. He disappeared back into the wild, not as a broken soldier seeking refuge, but as a predator returning home. The deep, dark canopy, once a place of terror, now became his sanctuary, his hunting ground. He embraced the darkness, the silence, the ancient secrets that had claimed his platoon. He became a part of the very horror he had fought so desperately to escape. And the jungle to this day holds the echo of his howls. They mingle with the howls of the original monster, a new voice added to the ancient chorus of dread. They are long, deep, and filled with a chilling, predatory joy. Alvaro, the last survivor, had become the next iteration, another monstrous guardian of the forest's dark heart, perpetuating the cycle of the curse. The jungle's breath now flowed through him, and his howls, sharp as blades beneath the moon, are a grim reminder of the price of survival in the suffocating darkness of its ancient, unyielding embrace. He didn't just escape hell, he became it. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you felt the chill, the doubt, or the pulse of the jungle's fear, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more immersive narratives, and leave a comment below telling us what you thought and from which city or country you're watching. Your engagement helps us bring more stories to life.